All right, welcome to session 2 of the topic on the idea of progress in the formation of modern America. So, this is session 2 we're starting today, and we're going to proceed from where we actually stopped, from the place where we stopped on the previous session, session 1, in that we were discussing now the ideas of progress that are going to become central to the thinking, to the world of meanings of the peoples living in the United States in the latter part of the 19th century. The 19th century, particularly the latter part of the 19th century, is extremely important because this is the time when the United States entered the age of modernity. It became a modern industrial society, the United States as a whole. Again, this is a process, of course, the process of modernity, as I explained in a previous discussion in the session 1. It's a process that actually initiated in the 1700s with the Industrial Revolution, the rise of a high-tech industrialized world, starting from England and elsewhere, moving into places like the United States as well in the early part of the 1800s. The coming of new technologies like machines, for example, factories, and so on and so forth. And of course, with those changes came also in the 1700s the ideas of progress, that all of the technological changes that were occurring during those times, European philosophers, thinkers, etc., interpret those changes as a sign of progress, that human societies were entering a new phase of growth or development that were going to transform the way of life of the human population in ways that have never been dreamed before. So we were moving into a new era again of technologies, in which technologies were going to aid human beings in the productions of goods, mass production, for example. So again, the 1700s was like the opening act of the modern age because of the new technologies, the Industrial Revolution, and so on and so forth, and in how people are going to start interpreting, of course, those changes as progress. That progress has been going all along for literally since the appearance of humans on Earth. That the way we live, the way we survive in the environment has changed over time in a progressive way, in stages, again, in which we have been moving from one stage to another and bettering and improving, of course, the way we live. And that's exactly how the thinkers, philosophers, etc., in Europe, and particularly we're going to be looking also in North America again, how those thinkers, philosophers are going to be interpreting the changes taking place around them in terms of progress. And progress will become the central idea of modern societies. The societies that were modernizing, they were undergoing transformations because of the Industrial Revolution, for example, and so on and so forth. Those societies are going to hold this idea as the central idea of human existence. This is the central meaning, in other words, of what human beings are doing here in this earth. They're human beings, in other words, from their perspective, are trying to improve and better themselves as individuals, but also they're trying to better themselves as a society as well. And of course, this was the meaning of life. We have to improve the way we live. We have to improve our systems of knowledge, what we call science. We have to improve our tools, we call technology. We have to improve our economic well-being. Okay, you can call that economic development or economic progress, and so on and so forth. And also that as new ideas of science are going to be introduced, the theory of evolution, people were convinced in the latter part of the 19th century that even progress was occurring in nature. That, again, the theory of evolution suggested that all living organisms have mutated over time and that every time organisms mutate as they struggle to survive in the environment, that there's improvement taking place as well. Okay, so this is what we're going to analyze in this second session now. We're going to be looking now very specifically to the ideas of progress, particularly starting with science and technology. Now, we started this section on science and technology on session 1, in that we started looking at the scientific revolution. The fact is that in the 19th century, there was now a new science, if you will, that was becoming the mainstream science that was being taught in schools and universities, and that the people that we call scientists were using this new science as the official established science again, and discarding all other methods and discarding all other scientific systems in the process. So we see again that there's going to be a new science. If we go to our lecture outlines here, we were talking about the scientific revolution that happened in the 1700s, and how that scientific revolution is going to bring what today we call modern science. Okay, the science that we use today. Okay, the science of the modern age. And like I said, in the 19th century, this particular science that was born in the 1700s will be the established official science again in centers of learning, etc., all across the United States, and of course the Western European countries as well. Now, just to give you a very quick overview of this science, so you can understand, how this science is coming into being, and how the scientists are going to use it in order to acquire knowledge. What we have to know here is that this science, okay, what we call modern science, was founded by a British physicist, British scientist, mathematician by the name of Isaac Newton in the late 1600s and early 1700s. He's the founder, the pioneer, the father of modern science, and that when he introduced this scientific system, he proposed a new way of studying nature, a new way of studying the universe at large. And the way that he proposed to study nature and the universe is by considering the universe as a machine. Okay, this is the mechanistic worldview, or the mechanical worldview. Isaac Newton saw that there was perfect rhythm and order in all aspects of nature. For example, the rotation of the planets, the rotation of the moon around the earth, the rotation of the planets around the sun, and so on. So it seemed for him that everything was moving in certain perfect order. Okay, that's the way nature works, just like a machine. If you take, for example, a clock. Back then, there were already clocks crafted by artisans and other people, scientists, and so on. That if you open the clock, if you see the inner workings and the inner pieces of the clock, you will see that there's dozens and dozens of little pieces all moving in perfect synchronicity, one after the other, and that as a whole they make the clock work. The hours and the minutes and the seconds, of course, move in perfect synchronicity. But the clock was made that way by the clock maker, if you will. So somebody made the clock to function in that way, and the maker actually programmed the clock to measure time in that specific way. So Isaac Newton believed that this was the way that the Creator created the universe. Like, in the beginning of time, the Creator created the cosmos, the universe, the planets, and everything in existence, and he created it to work like a gigantic machine. Okay, and programming this machine to function in a specific way. Okay, so there's certain programming, certain laws of nature that were placed there since the very beginning by the Creator. And of course, after the world was created and programmed by those laws, the Creator pretty much left the universe to function on its own, if you will. So again, this is very important because this is how modern science actually studies nature in a very mechanical way. Okay, very materialistic way, if you will. And so this is what I was actually elaborating on the end of session 1, is that this new science proposed, Newton particularly, that the only thing that we can actually study and know of this creation, it's material reality. In other words, that this universe for Newton was material, and so therefore this is the only aspect of creation that we can actually study it, because we can sense it. Okay, this is called secularism. The separation of the material world and the spiritual world. So again, this is called secularism. Again, the separation of the material and the spiritual. Newton believed that those two worlds were pretty much functioning independent under different laws, but for Newton, humans could only know the material as opposed to the spiritual. At least that's what he believed. Again, that humans had no access to study the spiritual world because it was far removed from this world. So for him, there was no way to access it, to measure it, to weight it, and so on and so forth, the spiritual world, that is. So therefore, what Newton suggested is that, well, let's just focus on the material aspect of creation. So this is called secularism, again, separating the spiritual and the material, and in this case, only studying the material aspect of creation, studying matter. What matter is, what are the elements of matter, what are the particles of matter, the behavior of matter, for example, the behavior of objects, and so on. Weight them, measure them, and so on and so forth. And again, use mathematical formulas to calculate physical events, and so on and so forth. So again, it's a science that is only going to study the material world. So it's a very materialistic perspective of the world. It's only focusing on the material level, that is to say. So what that actually did, that idea called secularism, is that is going to have an impact in human societies. When scientists are now proposing that reality is material and that's the only thing human beings can know and have access to, this is going to alter the way people see the world around them. In what way? Well, people that are now going to be trained under this science, the science of Isaac Newton, and this mechanical worldview, that accept the premise that reality is material, people are going to now try to separate as much as possible science and religion, as much as possible, pretty much everywhere. So first and foremost, that science and religion are two separate entities, first and foremost. They should be treated separately. Okay? Science concerns with material endeavors and studying the material world, and religion concerns with matter of faith. But also, people are going to try to separate, from this point onwards, state and church, or church and state. That the state should just focus on the happenings and the events of society on a material level and trying to organize that society with laws and so on and so forth. And the church should not be, participating in the decisions or matters of the state, but rather just be confined to the church and trying to guide people spiritually and so on and so forth. totally separate, worlds, that is to say. It's called secularism, again. So this is going to have an impact, as we'll see, in how nations are going to arise, starting with the United States in 1787, with the U.S. Constitution providing, of course, the separation of church and state. That was an idea heavily influenced by the scientific revolution of the 1700s and Isaac Newton, and that the founding fathers really wanted to separate church and state and have a nation in which the state and the church will be completely acting independently of one another. Because that's the way they were trained, that's the way they were educated, again, by the new science. But also, as we'll see, another effect of secularism, the separation of the spiritual and the material by this modern science, another effect that it had on human society is that people over time, as more and more people are going to be trained under this new science and accept the principles of secularism, people are going to become more and more concerned with the here and the now. Okay, this particular world that we live in, this physical existence, people are going to be more oriented towards the material world, to take care of their physical bodies, to nurture their physical bodies, but also to take care of their families, to take care of their communities, their societies on a material level. That this material existence is important, as opposed to the way people thought in the past, in which most people before the scientific revolution were not that concerned with this material existence, because they believed that the real existence that promised happiness was the afterlife. When people will die, this is when people expected to be rewarded or to go to certain places of rest or a heaven, to really, be truly happy, in other words, and suffering. And most people accepted the material world to be full of trials, to be full of suffering, that it was just, unavoidable. But now, what the scientific revolution is doing is that it's training people to see the material world as reality. So if it is real, so therefore, people are beginning to now become more and more oriented towards the material world and trying to find happiness in the here and the now. Maybe there's going to be an afterlife waiting for us when we die, they said. But this material world is also important. Heaven is important, but also this experience, this human experience in this material world is also important. So there's going to be that. Again, please pay attention that this is very important, because whenever there's a new idea proposed by science at any given age, at any time, when the scientists, the people of knowledge, propose a certain idea about reality, that changes the way people perceive life in general, and people reorganize themselves in that fashion. For example, society is becoming more materialistic, with the advent, with the coming of this new science that is saying, matter is real, and this is what we can know and study, and we should take care of it and be happy, again, in this material world. All right, so that's number one. Again, this is the first pillar of Newton's science. Is called secularism, when he pretty much separated the two realms, material and spiritual. But the second pillar of this new science that Newton brought is the way that we actually study the universe. The scientific method. What is the method that he proposed by which people acquire knowledge? It's called the scientific method. So in this very important principle, what Newton is really proposing is that since reality is material and we're participating in it and we're experiencing it, therefore knowledge comes from experience. That's what empiricism is. If you are to know anything about the material world, you have to experience it. You have to sense it. In other words, for anything to be real in the material world, you have to see it. You have to experience it with your senses, in other words. Okay? If you're saying that a certain element exists or a certain force exists, is because you have experienced it at some point. Again, you have witnessed it, you have gathered experience from observations. That is to say, you went out into the field, maybe you have a lab, etc., somewhere, and in that lab, you're conducting a series of observations and you're having an experience with something that is tangible, that is real, and that others can come and verify. It's not just you that is watching through the microscope or the telescope, a certain planet, etc., or you're watching, a molecule under the microscope, etc., but others can come and do it as well and verify it that is real, that is there. In other words, you're not, confusing imagination with material experience, that is to say. That is called empiricism, that in order to gather knowledge, once again, that the scientist must sense and experience that which you're studying. Okay, if you're discovering, a new bacteria, okay, under a microscope, you have to see it under the microscope. You have to sense it. You have to be able to detect it clearly, and others can come also and verify it as well. So empiricism is the name by which scientists go about conducting research in order to gather knowledge about matter, how matter works, how this machine we call the universe works. So it's a very materialistic approach, because only that which can be seen and detected with our senses is considered to be real by this new science, by the way. In the 19th century, empiricism was also known as positivism, because to make any claim, scientists need to be totally positive about the claim. If you discover one of the laws of nature, or if you discover one of the mechanisms of nature like rain or earthquakes, etc., and why they happen, you need to be positive. And what that meant is that you need to have facts. Okay, that's what the scientists of the age proposed. That you have to be positive. In other words, that you have gathered enough material evidence about that which you're studying that is overwhelming. Okay, that it points to a conclusion based on material evidence. This positive, that is to say, you have positive, experiences and evidence gathered, and of course that sustains your claims. Again, you're backing it up with facts, in other words. So again, this is very important, because from this point onwards, from Newton onwards, this is how scientists are following a certain method of inquiry, a method of research. You have to go and make observations. You have to experience that which you're studying. You have to be able to sense it, to see it, measure it, and others can also be called upon, other scientists, to conduct those observations and do it themselves again. So this is how now scientists are conducting their observations and their research. Now, this is very important to note that this method, the so-called scientific method, which will be this established method by the late 19th century, there was no doubt, by the late 19th century, this is the method that scientists across the board, pretty much everywhere in Western Europe and in North America, are pretty much conducting their research. Where there's medical research, where there's research in industries, or etc., again, in mining, in chemistry, in biology, every area, every field of science, they're following this method now. Okay? What's very important to note is that other cultures from around the world, when you look at other cultures, for example, indigenous cultures in Africa, indigenous cultures in the American continent, whether you go to in Asia, for example, places like India, in the subcontinent, for example, of India, or you go to Australia, there's a multiplicity of different cultures around the globe that don't really follow this scientific method, and they have different ways of learning and knowing. Okay, that does not limit to simply having a material experience. Okay, so it's very important that there's many cultures around the world that learn from visions. For example, there's many Native Americans that are learning from dreams and visions. The pursuit of a vision quest, for example, is a central theme in Native American thought. In that, when Native Americans desire to know something about themselves, something about their personal lives, about the past or the future, or they want to know something about something specific, like, let's say, medicine, they go into the forest or they go into the desert, and they fast for a number of days, and they conduct certain rituals, and then they claim to have certain experiences, certain visions, insights, revelations, visitations sometimes from supernatural beings that come and teach them something. Okay, so this is extremely important because in other cultures, people learn in other ways, like dreams. People have a specific dream about an elder coming to teach them about herbal medicine. Okay, so for a number of days, months, and years, they're learning medicine during dream states. Okay, so this is a whole different approach, again, that other cultures take. So see that as important because it is only in this part of the world that science is moving in this totally new direction. It's more materialistic, in other words, in their methods of learning. All right. So another thing. It's very important to note that in the 19th century, when this science that was born back in the late 1600s, early 1700s with Newton, by the 19th century, this science was becoming now mainstream. Okay, in places like England, France, Germany, Holland, the United States, for example. The people living during the 19th century saw this new science with very hopeful eyes, if you will. Okay, there were grand expectations, great hopes placed on this new science because the perception was that people had finally arrived to a way of studying nature that was going to deliver a lot of miraculous works of wonder, for example, that humans finally have reached the point in which finally they said we were going to now accumulate significant amount of information, data, and knowledge about nature, that humans were simply going to be taken to a whole new plane of existence with so much knowledge again. So that was the perception during this time. And of course, this is something that was even written by philosophers living during this period of time who were fascinated by the science and wrote about it. And many of those writings were widely read across Europe and also in the United States in a way that people cheered really the coming of this new science and really placed a lot of their hopes and aspirations and expectations on this new science, thinking that indeed human beings had finally got it, in other words. So to give an example, one of those thinkers that is cheering the birth of this new science was Auguste Comte. It was a French thinker, French philosopher who was fascinated by this new science and wrote about it. And he published a book called The Positivist Philosophy in 1842. And in this writing, in this publication, Auguste Comte is really saying that human beings finally have released themselves from the superstitions of the past. They have freed themselves from all of the limitations and the superstitions and the limited ideas that was holding people back. Because in the past, people used things like magic and religion to pretty much make sense of the world around them and trying to understand it. But what Auguste Comte believed was that magic and religion were children's stories or legends, if you will, and superstitions and myths that people told themselves to cope with a world that they really didn't understand. So again, this is his own idea. I'm not really saying that that's the case. I'm just saying this is Comte's interpretation. And with the scientific revolution, what Comte is saying, with Newton and the scientific revolution, he said, finally we have reached, the level of development that humans have developed their systems of knowledge just enough to arrive to the true way of actually going about studying this universe, in other words. So he really believed that this new science was a true science and that all the other sciences that existed in the world were not really true science, sciences, that is to say. I mean, this is what he actually implied. Now, what is most significant about the Positivist Philosophy, a book that was once again widely read across Europe and also in the United States, and people really were convinced of the ideas, the propositions of Comte in this book, is that what really Comte is suggesting is that this new science, call it modern science, was really going to transform human civilizations. And it was going to build a new one. And this was announcing the dawn of a new scientific era, the dawn of a new scientific age, a whole new world that was going to be radically different from everything that we have ever known. But most importantly, what Comte is suggesting is that this new science in the future, the promise, he said, that the promise of this science is that it will make people so knowledgeable. People will be able to discover all of the laws of nature that for the first time in human history, humans will unlock all of the mysteries of the universe. They will discover all of the laws of nature. They will discover everything about this universe, how it works, what matter is, and so on and so forth. All of the principles of the creation and so on and so forth that will enable them over time. That knowledge will enable people to actually master the universe, to master and control the forces of nature. So this is the ultimate promise of science, that it will allow people to know what the universe is and how it works in a way that human beings are going to actually master the universe and control it. In other words, become like gods. In other words, again, this is something that he is saying. Okay, this is a disclaimer here. It's just what I'm actually referring to is what people were writing, people were saying, people were thinking. Those views do not reflect my own. I'm just saying this is how people felt about the new science during this time. So this is the promise of modern science, that that through this science, people will become so knowledgeable that they will be able to overcome a lot of the problems that have afflicted human beings in the past. For example, in the past, people suffered from catastrophes, from droughts, for example, from floodings, from volcanic eruptions, and so on and so forth, from lack of food, famine, for example, epidemic diseases, and so on that were rampant in many centuries in the past. Um, so what Comte is saying is that in the past, since people did not have a scientific system that was accurate, he said, uh, people were simply victims of nature. They were victims of nature because they did not know how to deal with the forces of nature as they affected them, the catastrophes, the calamities that happen in nature. This is part of human experience, by the way, experiencing life inside of nature. But what Comte is saying is that that time will soon be over, he said. Again, so there were high hopes and expectations placed on this science, and that people felt that finally, in the future, maybe in the 20th century, maybe the 21st century, human beings will be pretty much the masters of the universe. We're going to get there. Maybe we have not yet unlocked all of the mysteries, but we're getting closer and closer to that point. So, this is what people expected and hoped for. The science was going to deliver pretty much miracles that were going to be works of wonder, changing the ways people live, creating more and more comforts for people, perhaps even solving the problems of sickness and disease, stopping, for example, things like aging, and perhaps even death itself. Those are huge claims, by the way, but nonetheless, people felt that way during this time. So the significance of this is that there was a significant number of people who were trained in this new science, who, as they abandoned the religion of the past and became more and more oriented towards a scientific type of analysis, an understanding of science, understanding the world through science, what actually ended up happening is that by the late 19th century, what we see is that more and more people were accepting science as a new religion. Okay, more and more people were turning to science for answers and solutions. That instead of turning to religion for answers and solutions for the things that happen in the world, that more and more people began to place more faith in science. So science itself was becoming the religion of the modern age. This is very significant because still, even the people that abandoned all the beliefs about a creator, for example, a supreme being, they did not really become truly 100% atheists, in that they still believed in something. They believed in nature. They believed in natural laws, in the laws of nature. And that's believing in something, by the way. And they believed that science was going to provide solutions to the problems of humanity, the problems of the world. So it was becoming a sort of like a religious system, that it was providing comfort to people. People were finding meaning in this new science, and were becoming more and more, again, oriented towards this system of thought that we call modern science. So now we shift our attention to technology. Okay, as again, this is the first area we're going to analyze, again, is science and technology. So we covered so far the scientific revolution, but now let us assess the area of technology, because as we'll see, in the 19th century was the century of technological revolutions. So let us assess that. All right. So there's in the 19th century great changes taking place in the realm of technology, due to the fact that there's now a great number of people that are earning degrees in universities and so on in different fields of science. We're going to see that those scientists are going to be pretty much conducting research for most of their lives, not only to gather knowledge and find how the world works, but actually to use that knowledge to create new tools, the new technologies, that is to say. So the 19th century was the century when all of the tools of modern life were innovated and brought to life. So everything that we are so familiar with, that is so essential today for modern societies, all our technologies, they go back to the 19th century. Many people go and see back to the 20th century as the century of technology. This is where all those technologies came into being and so on. We tend to think that way, but in reality, it was the 19th century. You go back to the 19th century, and you see that this is the time when there was at least five different tools that will become the backbone, the life force of the modern age that we live in. Okay, so particularly in the latter half of the 19th century, we're going to see waves and waves of inventions, new technologies that are altering the way people live. And this really confirmed, by the way, the claim by many people, particularly the new scientists, that this science was delivering. That indeed, all of the technologies that were introduced in society were simply a sign that human beings were on the right track, in other words. Okay? So, let us then assess the new technologies, okay? The tools of modern life, that is indicated here. And let us explain each one of them one by one, so we have a full understanding. Not only, again, it's just like a survey, and that we just mention them and you just write down those inventions and move forward, but we have to have some form of understanding how those inventions are going to be changing the way people live, the way people do work, particularly, but also the way people socialize as well with each other. So let's start with the most important one. This is the very first technological invention or innovation or discovery, if you will, that is going to initiate the technological revolution of the 19th century. And that is electricity. Okay, electricity, otherwise known as electromagnetism. This is a force of nature. This is a force that exists in nature, that is to say, and we experience it in the form of lightning. Okay, this is one of the most obvious expressions of electromagnetism occurring in nature. Every time you see a lightning, that's what it is, by the way. So it is in the 19th century when finally some scientists were able to generate electricity and conduct it, of course, through wires. And as we'll see, this force is going to be used to power things like motors in industries. So this is going to increase productivity. Industrial production is going to be accelerated with the introduction of electrical motors. Now the motors that are powered by electricity are going to be moving the machinery that are in the process of conducting, of course, manufacturing. So this is going to alter the way people work, because this is going to be moving the mechanical uh, parts within industry in the process of production. So even mass production is going to accelerate even further. Of course, the scientist that take credit for this invention was the scientist of the name by the name of Hans Christian Oersted. So by 1822, he's the one that actually came up with the first electrical generator. And by using their generator, of course, people will be able to generate their own electricity and to be used for, once again, powering up industrial plants, factories, but also, as we'll see, to provide light, artificial light, if you will, to offices, homes, and so on, in public parks and cities, and so on and so forth. So this is very important because during the 19th century, people just did not really understand this process of generating electricity. They understood that electricity happened in nature. There was, of course, a fascination about electricity or electromagnetism that had existed since very early times, in our human ancestors. For example, the fact that one of the first gods that people worshipped in the distant past were the lightning gods, for example. So there has always been a fascination about this force of energy. People have worshipped lightning because of its awesome power, its awesome power of destruction. Again, people understood that lightning could indeed devastate trees instantaneously, burn them up, or cut the mountain in half, etc., and so on and so forth. It was an awesome power of nature that many people pretty much interpreted as as coming from a god, or the awesome powers of the gods, if you will. So there has always been a fascination about it, and also there has always been an interest in capturing, of course, that force. There's always been in the imagination of people the idea that when will be the time when human beings will be able to actually capture the force of electricity and use it for their own purposes. Humans will become very powerful. That was the idea. Whoever comes up with, again, the way of capturing or storing or generating that force, that they will become like the gods. Okay, for example, they will become creators themselves. So this is now happening in the 19th century when we see the Swedish science, Hans Christian Oersted, of course, coming up with the first electrical generator. And now with the generation of electricity, we're going to see that what people simply understand is that this is what lightning is. What you experience as lightning, this electromagnetism, is being generated now. Human beings have now arrived to the formula of being able to generate it for themselves. And now the way it's being used is that this mysterious force is the force that is moving magically the mechanical parts of industry. That all those machines are moving by themselves through this force. So this was something that bordered on magic by the the times that we're talking about here, the 19th century, by the standards of that time. That seemed like an act of magic. Mechanical parts moving by themselves. The motors moving, the mechanical parts. Producing those things for us. It's almost like the machines that people had invented now have a life of their own. There's a mysterious life moving through them, and they're working for us. They said, those machines are actually working for people, and the idea was that at one point humans will be free from that type of work, because instead of being working day in, day out, inside of those factories, moving those mechanical parts by hand, and now that electricity was going to be moving those mechanical parts by itself, of course. So you have to understand that there is a change taking place in the way people see those new technologies, by the way. All right, so as I mentioned, in the 19th century, in 1879, there was a scientist who came up with another invention that would be also powered by electricity, the light bulb. Even though there were other scientists during this time that were working on that as well, that probably, you know, might have come up with that invention even before him. But Thomas Edison is the one that is credited for inventing the light bulb. Of course, and the light bulb itself was perceived by people during this time as a gadget by which people captured and froze a piece of lightning. The lightning that you see in the sky was captured and brought to you, to your home, so it can actually light it up at night. Okay, you have a piece of lightning here that is frozen, if you will. That's how people thought, how people perceive those inventions. So again, this is going to alter the way people live. There's going to be, of course, homes that will have their own, light bulbs, and will have, more light available. But also cities are going to be illuminated as well, public parks and streets and so on, offices, buildings, industries, and of course night shifts in industries. We're going to see the introduction of night shifts because now people can work at night. There's no reason to stop production. Electricity can be aiding, the machinery to work, but also, again, the lights that are introduced inside of industry will allow people to continue working, a night shift as well. So it's also changing the way we do work as well. Those inventions, that is to say. Okay, so the second the second tool of modern life is number 2, the modern transportation systems that are going to transform the way people live and the way people create communities as well. Okay, it's very important. So this is the second tool of modern life. Is that this is another feature of modern societies, is that they have modern transportation systems. Okay, of course, today we have a host of different types of transportation systems that facilitate our, movement, our traveling, and so on across the world, of course. But in the 19th century, when people talk about modern transportation systems in the most practical sense, they talked primarily about railroads. There's also steamships, of course, okay, that are facilitating people's movements and traveling around the world. But inside of the countries, of course, the modern countries that are undergoing those changes and transformation, that are modernizing. When we talk about transportation, we refer to railroads, okay? So this is extremely, extremely essential, for people living in modern societies, in the modern age. In the 19th century, of course, the coming of the railroads in the United States occurred around the 1830s. This is the beginning stages of the railroad revolution in the United States, but it was only happening in one area of the country, that is the North. Okay, in the North in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, prior to the Civil War, we see the massive construction of rail lines across the northern states that brought the North together economically, commercially, and even, again, politically, culturally, etc. It was a region that was very, very consolidated, very unified, by the way. And railroad construction was happening at a much slower rate in the South, of course, before the Civil War. But after the Civil War comes to an end in 1865, we're going to see that there's going to be a second wave of railroad construction taking place in the United States. But in this case, it was happening all over the country, not only in the north, but it was rapidly spreading across the southern states and rapidly extending in the latter decades of the 19th century across the so-called Wild West. So even if the development of the Wild West happened due to the coming of the railroads again to the western territories in the West. So we're going to see that in the latter decades of the 19th century, the United States is going to be consolidated and unified. All of the regions of the country, the North, the South, and the West, are going to come together as one. So instead of being, the country being fragmented the way it was in the past, and pretty much every region operating semi-independently from each other, now there's going to be a true unification of all of the states, and all of the territories are coming together thanks to the railroad, by the way. The railroad aided the movements of people across state lines. So therefore, by moving people from state to state, people in the United States are going to see themselves as Americans. Okay, so instead of seeing yourself, for example, as a northerner or a southerner, etc., and so on, with the railroad integrating the country together, and people traveling and conducting commercial activities and so on, trade, or relocating from one state to the other and so on, people are going to gain the sense that despite the fact that they belong to different states and different regions, that because people are traveling back and forth through the system of transportation, that they all share the same national territory, that they were all Americans, they were all citizens of the United States, no matter in which region you live. So this created a sense of community, a sense of belongingness, in other words, among peoples of living in different regions. And of course, this was essential, the building of the railroads, in building the modern nation state. In other words, the nations that are on the rise in the 19th century and onwards are coming to life, and to a great extent thanks to the railroad itself. The nation states that again are rising, of course, started out with the United States, when the United States formed, of course, the Republic in 1787. This was the first nation state, okay, in world history. And after that, there's going to be a host of different countries, particularly in Europe, that are going to be forming also their nation states as well, going from a kingdom to a nation state. So in this transition towards nationhood, the railroad aided pretty much the building of those nations, because it was bringing people together, people that lived in different provinces and different regions of those countries were unified under the railroad itself. So it's a very important development. So this is extremely important, the building of the nation state by the railroad, but also in the United States with the rise of the big cities, the big industrial cities. We also see the railroad lines being built, rail stations, to facilitate the transportation of people around the city. Again, the so-called metro rail. Okay, the metro rail was also very, very important in facilitating again a system of transportation for the people living in those cities. Again, cities that were gigantic in scope, geographically speaking, they were so big, and so there had to be some form of transportation system provided for people to move about. Okay, we still have roughly 20 more minutes. So the third tool of modern life I want to discuss is telecommunication systems. So we discussed electricity, We have discussed modern transportation systems like the railroad. So in this technological revolution, there's going to be yet a third technological innovation here, the introduction of what today we call modern telecommunication systems. So today we're so accustomed to those telecommunication systems that they're just so essential for us that without them we just will not know what to do. Whether we talk about cell phones or we talk about the internet, for example, or streaming, for example, etc. Satellites and so on and so forth. So we are already in that age, in this age, and for us it's just is the norm. We take it for granted. The ability to communicate with people around the world instantaneously. We can see them, we can hear them, and so on. So just normal. But for the people of the 19th century, this was a totally new development. So we have to go back and see how the people living this time are actually interpreting those new technologies and what it meant for them. So, to see it in its proper context, that is to say. So, again, modern telecommunication systems really were first introduced in the 19th century around the 1840s with the coming of the telegraph. Okay, so the telegraph was a gadget, an electrical gadget that generated impulses of electricity and transferred those impulses across wires. Okay, very similar to how electricity works, but in this case, the telegraph is going to be beeping or transmitting impulses of electricity in certain patterns using numbers. So 1 beep, 2 beeps, 3 beeps, 4 beeps, and so on and so forth. And the number of beeps or impulses received on the other end, on the other telegraph, will have to interpret those impulses in terms of letters, in terms of words. So, of course, there was the need to develop a code. And this is exactly what happened in the 1840s with the introduction of the telegraph, is that we got, again, the first technologies for people to start communicating on vast spans of space from one city to the other or from one state to another and so on and so forth, messages or news of something that was happening particularly in one area of the country and trying to send it into different areas of the country. So news can travel faster and faster, information to travel faster and faster. So the telegraph itself was the forerunner of what today we call the internet, if you will. This was the kindergarten version of what today is the internet, and see the internet perhaps as the university, level again of communication. So this was a really baby step, if you will, of trying to move into this new direction in trying to disseminate information as quickly as possible by means of technology instantaneously from point A to point B. Okay, that was the idea. Okay, with the telegraph. And again, news are going to start traveling really fast from place to place. So much so that by the 1860s there was again telegraph lines being built all over the United States, and by 1867 the first telegraph line was completed between the United States and Europe. Okay, so now Europe has a direct line of communication, telegraph, with the United States. And so events that happen in Europe, political events, economic events, cultural, and so on, can be wired, so to speak, to the U.S. And vice versa. So the news, the next day you can read something that happened in Europe, the day before, that quick, that fast. So you can be informed of certain things that affect Europeans, or Europeans reading about Americans, and so on and so forth. So the world was becoming gradually, slowly but surely, more interconnected through the telegraph, so to speak. It was the beginning stages of that interconnectivity, if you will. In the 1870s, another piece of telecommunication gadget was innovated, that telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell. He wondered whether it would be possible to take the principle of the telegraph and actually accelerate it further. That instead of people sending impulses of electricity in patterns, that it will be possible to actually hear the voice of another person and be able to talk to them, instantaneously. So he invented, of course, the telephone is really a mic and a speaker put on one end, the phone you're using, and then connecting it through wires. So on the other end, there will be a mic and a speaker, and in that way, you can actually hear the voice of the other person. So this is going to connect people together even further, because you're going to connect with people, family members, relatives, friends, for example, that are far away, that leave home, etc. You can have instantaneous communication with them. News, for example, what happens in Congress, a piece of legislation, etc., can be disseminated all over the country, and so on and so forth. So this is also going to bring people together and create a sense of community, if you will. As people are sharing ideas, they're sharing information with one another, and so on and so forth. So this is extremely important, again, as the world is changing through communications. This is going to create a whole new society that is far more connected, more integrated, if you will, because of the information and the communication that they share. Now, the significance of those telecommunication systems is that, number one, the telegraph and the telephone, despite the fact that by our standards today they look very simplistic, nonetheless the effects were very, very significant, very powerful, the effects on the world. Because what the telegraph and the telephone did is to initiate what today called the age of information, or the information age. There's no doubt about that. We tend to think about the internet in that fashion, the World Wide Web and satellites only, as initiating the information age, but everything has its origins. Modern telecommunication systems, the ones that we use today, originated in the 19th century with those inventions, and people began to feel the effects of the information age as early as the 19th century. More and more information is traveling very fast, instantaneously across the world. Information is beginning to travel instantaneously through the telegraph and the telephone. News are traveling very fast. Knowledge is traveling very fast. Ideas are traveling very fast. So it's very important. And that also altered the way people perceive time. The information that was easily available and transmitted through the telegraph and telephone also had an impact in the way people perceive time, in that more and more people are beginning to experience time as accelerating, quickening, that is to say, the quickening of time, that is to say. Why? Well, because so much information that was becoming available, whether people are reading the news, whether because they're communicating ideas through the telephone, etc., and so on and so forth, it was so overwhelming for people that people had more information, more data to digest and process. So we begin to fill our minds with so much information that is coming across through those systems of communication, our minds are going to become more active. And as the mind is becoming more and more active, the sense is that time is accelerating. It's not that it is. It's just that our mind is accelerating, and we tend to think that that's time that is doing so. Okay, when you're not thinking about anything, when your mind is calm, we gain the sense that time comes to a still because we're not thinking anything. But as we fill our mind with ideas and information, and we're thinking all the time, the opposite is true. Okay, so that's very important to contemplate, and this, a characteristic of modern societies is that that's the general sense, the general experience that their time is quickening. By the way, all right. So the fourth tool of modern life is chemistry. Is going to be a new tool that was born with the introduction of a new field of science. Will simply be called chemistry. But the field of chemistry was already a field of inquiry that existed in many, many centuries past. In many, many centuries past, people simply called it alchemy. Okay? The alchemists were the ones that were actually studying the natural world, the molecules, the compounds of nature, because what they wanted is to create a potion to prolong human life, to stop aging, for example, or to stop the process of dying. The potions of the eternal youth, for example, to be young forever, but also they wanted the potions of immortality as well, the alchemists of old. And they gather a lot of knowledge in those pursuits, of course. But by the 19th century, because there's a new science, that's more materialistic, the alchemists of the past are now going to be called chemists. And this is where the word chemistry actually comes from. It comes from the word alchemy. So through their research, by the 1870s, the chemists were able to already present the very first charts of the elements that they have uncovered in nature. Okay, the elemental table, again, was presented in 1870, pretty much charting the elements that they have detected from nature, from their observations, and of course they wanted to have an understanding of the particles of creation, the particles of the universe, the building blocks, if you will, of life and nature as a whole, creation. That's what they wanted to do. And of course, the chemists were also attempting to create potions, we call pharmaceuticals, of course, medicine, in order to likewise be able to heal certain ailments and prolong life on earth for human beings, for example. So chemistry is also going to have an effect also on the rise of pharmaceutical industries, by the way. So again, in their pursuit of the particles of creation, they're going to uncover a host of different chemical substances and chemical compound structures that they're detecting, they're observing through the microscope. And what they're revealing is that many of those substances actually had geometrical forms or geometrical shapes, that the molecules, the particles, the compounds, the substances that they study, in many cases, they have geometrical shapes. And so what this is going to do is that this is going to have an effect on the way people are going to perceive reality. In what way? Well, the scientists are presenting a new level of reality that is hidden from ordinary sight. So instead of perceiving reality the way we do with our just physical eyes and the way we see nature, from the eyes of a chemist, they perceive reality to be geometrical. Okay, because deeper, when you examine in the deeper realms, for example, of the skin of a human being or a bark of a tree, the skin of an animal, or the leaf of a plant, everything is geometrical. So those findings, those revelations are going to be revealed by the artists. Again, the artists in society are going to reveal the new ideas, the new insights of the new science, and display them in their works. So this is exactly what's happening then in the United States and also in Europe, is that there's going to be an artistic movement on the rise known as Cubism, in that the painters, the Cubists as they were known, uh, began to paint human beings and landscapes not as they appear to us from our ordinary physical eyes, but rather how they appear under a microscope. That is to say, to the from the eyes and the observations of a chemist, for example. And so again, this, instead of painting a human being the way that human being appears, and creating a kind of exact replica of the face of that individual, they're going to be painting it in this fashion, for example, okay, in cubes, because it's geometry. There's geometry in the fabric of creation, and for the cubists, this was far more real, more consistent with nature. That is to say, than just painting the face, the face, the surface of the face of the person. In other words, they'll paint, for example, people having a conversation, okay, and this is the way they will see it. Oh, there's people, having a conversation. Well, their faces are all full of cubes in this case, because this is the way that science is revealing to us this level of reality. So this is very important, because art is really providing us a window into the thinking, the mindset, the perception of the people that were living during those times in the late 19th century. So art really opens up really a window into the world that 19th century, late 19th century Americans and Europeans were beginning to change their overall perception of life in general. And this is pretty much something that art does, by the way. Artists, when you want to really see or understand the way people interpreted the universe, how they saw the universe, what it meant for them, etc. In any society, at any given point of human history, one way to do that is to look at the art that they produce, because that art is going to reveal the fundamental beliefs, the fundamental ideas and perceptions and meanings of the people that produce those works. So during this time, inevitably what we see is that the Cubists were revealing to the world that perception was changing. Okay? The scientific ideas were having a deep impact in the way people saw the world around them, more geometrical. So the last tool of modern life I want to talk about is medicine, modern medicine. So this is the last tool of modern life that came with the technological revolution of the 19th century. It was innovated throughout, of course, the entire century, the 19th century, but by the late 19th century, that medicine, called modern medicine, which we use today, became the official established system to study health and disease. So what modern medicine did was to take the basic principles of Newton's mechanical worldview, in that if the universe is indeed a machine, and we have to understand it mechanically, how this machine operates, the doctors of the 19th century therefore concluded that if the universe is a machine, therefore the human organism is also a machine. So we have to understand it mechanically, so we need to detect the different parts of this machine. We have to know which organs are inside of the organism, and which organs are responsible for what function. Okay, so we got a pair of lungs. What are the lungs? What's the purpose of the lungs? What is the purpose of the brain? What is the purpose of the heart, the liver, the kidneys, and so on, and how they work and how they function together in a mechanical way. So this is how, again, people are beginning to now study the human organism and trying to come up, with, solutions for healing certain ailments and so on and so forth in a kind of mechanistic way. So I'm just going to mention very briefly here several aspects of this new medicine that is on the rise. And again, the first one is, of course, that modern medicine became very well established in the 1870s when Louis Pasteur made some breakthroughs in the world of micro or biology, in that he discovered pretty much the mechanism of disease, if you will, in terms of what makes us sick from time to time, in terms of the epidemic diseases that arise from time to time. And he discovered, of course, a microscopic world of microbes and germs that what he discovered is that those are the entities responsible for producing disease in the human organism. But at the same time, he discovered, again, a mechanism that is inbuilt within us called the immune system that is also responsible to fight off those microorganisms once they enter our body. So he's the one that pretty much discovered that aspect of health and disease that involves the immune system and, of course, microbes and germs in the 1870s. And, of course, with that came, of course, the kind of technologies that modern medicine uses to address from time to time the diseases that arise in human societies. And those are, of course, vaccines and drugs, of course. Then through vaccination, you can indeed create some form of immunity, and of course the drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, by the way. In other words, potions or brews, we call pharmaceuticals in this case, that can be created in order to provide relief to a lot of discomforts, things like, for example, headaches, migraines, stomach aches, and so on and so forth, that they can be lessened or they can be done away with certain pharmaceuticals or cure-all potions, like the alchemists. Remember, the alchemists were making potions and brews. So, I mean, they're going to become part of the new medical technologies, if you will, of modern science. But also, the last aspect I want to talk about again of modern medicine is the realm of psychology and psychiatry. They become very well established by the late 19th century. They were part of the new medicine, mental health. So the field of psychology and psychiatry are born during this time, in that the way they study the mind and all of the problems affecting the mind is that they're going to see it as a mechanical process that involves the brain. So instead of seeing problems dealing with mental and emotional turmoil and instability as part of the effect of spirits and demons, instead of looking at behavior in that fashion in mental health, psychiatry and psychology are going to propose that instead
many of the problems affecting the human mind and the emotions can be seen as problems originated in the brain, malfunction or imbalances and so on and so forth, that perhaps can be treated in certain centers such as asylums. Okay, we can see the construction of mental asylums, mental institutions. People are going to be sent there to get some treatments of various kinds so their mind can be restored or healed, or address some of the issues affecting, of course, their mind. So we reached the end of our class. This is the end of session 2. When we come back on session 3, we're going to cover the remnants, the remaining portion of this topic, dealing with economic progress and also with evolution. And again, this is what we're going to be dealing with when we come back in session 2. But as for now, this is all I have for you. This is the end of our class. So so when we come back again, we're going to actually continue with this discussion. All right? Good night.